Savior forever. He saw me and bought me with his redeeming blood. He loved me, yeah, I knew him, and all my love is due him. He plunged me to victory beneath the cleansing flood. Oh, the flood. Amen.
Bubbles. This one for me. Uh-oh. I gotta clean that. I will build it. Uh-oh, I built. Oh. Slippery.
I gotta clean that, right? I gotta clean that. Look, we laugh and we laugh about it, but I don't know about you, man. But why is it when I watch this video, the questions that came to my mind is why do we feel like we have to clean it all up? Why do we feel like we have to clean that? Maybe do we think that God is too big to clean up our mess? That He's too big to be bothered with our mess? Maybe that's what it is. Maybe it's because we're embarrassed of our mess, and so we just think that maybe we should just clean that up, and maybe He won't see, huh? But I just wonder sometimes, like, why do we put ourselves in these positions to where we have to clean? We think we have to clean it, and God is going to sit there with the camera and make a funny video. Because I don't know about you, but I've tried to clean a lot of my messes, and it seems like every time I try to clean my own mess, I end up falling right in the middle of a spot that I thought I had cleaned, right? But we keep doing it. We keep thinking that we have to clean it. Maybe it's because we think that nobody else can do it quite the way that we can. See, I don't know about you, but I have a problem with delegation. I have a problem with delegating things, and it's because I think that, like, no one can really, they're not going to get it the way that I want it to be done. And so, like, I'm the guy that even when we're gone and it's supposed to be a day off or it's supposed to be we're on vacation, you're checking your phone, you're checking messages, because in the back of your mind you're always thinking what doesn't get checked doesn't get done. And so I always find myself going back and saying, you know what, I know they're supposed to take care of it, but I'm just going to go up there and do it myself, because at least then I know that it's right. Man, did they start the camera? Did they gas up the vans? Did they do that? You constantly running through your brain of, like, you've asked somebody to do something, but you never give them the chance to do it, right? You never give them the chance to do it. And when we walk through life with this attitude that nobody can do it quite the way that we can, we start to reflect that to God too. Well, God just can't do it the way that I can either. And so we say, like, God, can you work this situation out for me? Can you get in the gap for me? Can you stand in the gap for me? But then we say, you know what? Never mind. Never mind. You're taking too long. Or maybe it's just that, you're not going to do it the way that I want. You're not going to do it exactly how I've got it pictured in my mind. And so I'm going to go do it myself. I promise I won't spill it. Oops, I spilled. Right? There's another reason. And the first thing that I want us to know is this. In John 15:5, Jesus says this, plain and simple. He says, I am the vine. I am the vine. I'm the one that gives the source. I'm the vine, you're the branches. The one that remains in him, in me, and I in him, produces much fruit. Because you can do what? What is it? Maybe a few things. Is it a few things? Maybe a little bit. Is it a little bit? It says what? Nothing. You can do nothing without me. You can do nothing without me. Did you know the very fact that you're breathing right now, you're doing that with His help? Because He's the one that keeps your lungs going. He's the one that provided the air for you to breathe. He's the one that told my heart to beat, and He's going to be the one that tells my heart when to stop beating. You can do nothing without me. I think one of the reasons that we try to clean it all up ourselves is because we're buying into this lie that's permeating our churches right now. And I'm not going to put any preacher on blast, but I would love to. I really would. But there's a few that try to tell us that the reason that we don't have what we want, the reason that we don't have things in our lives is because we don't believe enough. We're not doing enough. Our faith isn't strong enough. The reason that you're not driving in a Porsche is because you just don't believe that God can give you a Porsche. The reason that you don't have $1 million in your bank account is not because you're too lazy to get up and get a job. It's because God, you don't believe enough that God can put $1 million in your bank account. Or even worse, the reason that your loved one died. The reason that someone in your family is stricken with cancer, the reason that they're not getting the healing is because you're not praying enough. It's because you don't believe enough. You see where the danger of this thinking can take us? It takes us right back to sitting on the floor with a paper towel trying to clean up our mess so that God will act. If you got a pen, I want you to write this down if you're one of those people that takes notes, because I want you to understand that our ability to believe has absolutely no effect on God's capability to perform. Our ability to believe has no effect on God's capability to perform. What do I mean by that? Our faith has limits, but God's faithfulness is without end. The only thing, and hear me on this, church, the only thing that can affect a move of God is the will of God. That's it. The only thing that can affect a move of God is the will of God. Think about Joseph. And I'm not talking about Mary's Joseph. I'm talking about all the way back into Genesis. Joseph with the coat of many colors. How many of y'all remember that? How many of y'all remember Joseph with the coat of many colors? Huh? He was the youngest son at the time. Benjamin came later. And he got sent out to the field to find his brothers. And when he finds his brothers, they see him coming and they make a plot to kill him. Y'all remember the story? And one brother's like, no, let's not kill him. And they trap him in a pit. And then they sell him into slavery. You know the story. They sell him into slavery. He goes into Egypt. He starts to work for Potiphar. And then what happens? Potiphar's wife tries to sleep with him. And because he's a man of integrity, he runs. And he gets thrown in prison. And then he talks to some people in prison. And he's like, hey, look, man, when you get out, don't forget me. And they forgot him. And he stays in prison a little bit longer. And then ultimately what happens? He gets out. And he brings salvation to the entire nation of Israel because he's in a position that God wanted him to be in. Now, you can't make me believe for 1 second that when he was in the pit, he didn't cry out to God, to the God that he knew, to the God that could save him, to the God that he loved. You can't tell me that he didn't cry out to be saved. You can't tell me that when he was sold into slavery, he didn't sit back and say, my God, what are you doing? You can't tell me that when he was in prison and he was forgotten, he's like, God, are you ever going to open these doors? And he believed. But you know what stayed the move of God in that situation? The will of God. Because God knew where he needed to be and when he needed to be there. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, y'all know the story. They got thrown into the fiery furnace, right? It's King Nebuchadnezzar, he lays out this decree, and it's like, if anybody bows down to any other god, then they're going to be thrown into the furnace. And he calls Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in, and he's like, hey, what are y'all doing? It's come to my attention that you're not doing this. Look, when the lyre and the harp and everything rings, you're going to bow down and you're going to worship. And he says this in Daniel chapter 3, 15 and 18. And there's this one spot where Nebuchadnezzar says, and who is the God who can rescue you from my power? And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, man, I love it. I love this. In verse 18, they say this. Nebuchadnezzar, in verse 18, they say this. They say Nebuchadnezzar, in verse 18, they say this, but even if he does not rescue us, because before this they told him, they said, Nebuchadnezzar, we don't have to give you an answer to who our God is. But he says this in verse 18, they said, but even if he does not rescue us, we want you as king to know that we will not serve your gods or worship the gold statue that you set up. So they're saying, Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to give you an answer to your question. If the God we serve exists, then he can rescue us from the furnace. He can rescue us from the blazing fire. He can rescue us from your power. But even if he doesn't, we are still not going to worship you. And the way that the story plays out, of course, is that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're thrown into the furnace, and Jesus shows up. Y'all, I'm laying this on you, man. That's who was in the furnace with them, y'all. It was Jesus. And they're saved. So here we have one that went through everything. He went through the pit. He went through the slavery. He went through prison. He went through all of these things, begging to be saved. And in every situation, it looked like God wasn't going to move. Am I right? And then here we have another situation where God immediately moved. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they had the understanding that the will of God can affect a move of God. They said even if he doesn't, they knew he might choose to not save us. And if he chose not to save us, or if he chose not to save Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we would have been talking about a completely different story, but can I tell you, we'd still be talking about it. We would be talking about these brave men that stood for their faith and died for their faith. That's what we would be talking about, am I right? But God chose to move. Why did God choose to move? He chose to move because of what happened in Daniel chapter 3, verse 28 and 29. Nebuchadnezzar exclaimed, "Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego." Praise to the God. God chose to move because of the effect that it would have on Nebuchadnezzar. God chose to move because of the effect that it had on Nebuchadnezzar. In verse 29, Nebuchadnezzar says, "Therefore I issue a decree that anyone of any people, nation, or language who says anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego will be torn limb from limb and his house made a garbage dump. For there is no other God who is able to deliver like this." Why did God move? God moved for the protection of everyone. God moved so that he could be glorified, so that he could be praised in that situation. But you know what? Even in the other, is God not still being glorified? Do we not still see that God is a God that saves? Maybe not in an instant. It may take a while, but God is a God that saves. I'm not going to ask you to go there, but in John 17, and I urge you to read this in John 17, just the chapter. John chapter 17, it's a prayer that Jesus gives to the Father. And in verse 15, he's talking about his disciples and how you've given them to me, and I'm in them just like you're in me. And he says, I'm not praying that you take them out of the world, but I pray that you protect them from the evil one. Jesus is praying for the protection of his disciples from the evil one. Can I tell you that every one of the disciples, with the exception of John, died a horrific death. They died martyrs for the faith. And I would say that there's nobody that believes in the power of God and the ability of God to move greater than Jesus himself. Jesus understood that it's not about our wants, it's about his will. See, here's the thing. God didn't say that he would save. He didn't say that he would spoil us. He said that he would save us. That's what God promised. He said that he would save us, not spoil us. Look, the world right now is full of a bunch of entitled you-know-whats. Am I right? You know I'm talking. You know I'm telling the truth, right? Anybody that's like over the age of 30 is, or maybe 40. Anybody over the age of 40 is saying, oh my Lord, are you right? Huh? Unless they live in California. I probably shouldn't have said that. That was probably a line, but I don't think anybody in California has got the guts to come to Texas and tell us how to think anyway, so we're good. Anyway, why are they like this? Because we raised them to spoil them instead of raising them to be saved. Huh? We raised them for the goods instead of the gospel. Because we wanted to just give them something and reward them for nothing, than to teach them about suffering and the will of God and discipline. God said that he would save us, not spoil us. There's a truth, and it's a played out scripture, but it's played out in the sense that it's said over and over and over and over again, to the point to where some people are just like, oh my gosh, why is this your response to everything? But it's Romans 8:28. And it says simply that we know that all things work together for the good of those who love God and that are called according to his purpose. We know. So it doesn't matter if God moves in an instant or if he moves in another way. It doesn't. Look, here's the deal. It's always about his will and not our wants. But what he did promise is that he will make everything good come out of it for those that love God and that are called according to his purpose. Look, here's the thing, and I wish I had, as a pastor, I wish I had really good answers for questions like why? Why do bad things happen to good people? Why do some people get healed and some people don't? And I'm sorry, but the only answer that I can give is simply this. It's about the will of God and not about our wants. And unfortunately for us, we have to come to a place like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego where we can say in every situation, I know that my God can save. I know that my God can deliver. I know that my God can heal. But even if he doesn't, I'm not going to let it change the fact that he's my God. Look, Genesis chapter 3. You want to know why bad things happen to good people? It's simply this, because we move outside of the will of God. That's why that's why it happens. Because every time somebody moves outside of the will of God, it affects someone else. It doesn't just affect you. Anytime that we move outside of the will of God, everyone around us is affected. The minute that Adam decided to walk outside of the will of God and to stand passively by, while his house was under attack, It wasn't Eve's fault, guys. It was ours. We stepped outside of the role that God had intended us to have. Adam sat by when the woman that he said, this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. He sat back and watched her come under attack and did nothing. And as soon as this happened, you know what started happening after that? Bad things started happening to good people. Abel was killed by his brother Cain. What did Abel do? A bad thing happened to a good person. Joseph was sold into slavery and thrown into a pit and almost killed. Something bad happened to a really good person. And if you go through Scripture, you will find that there are story after story after story of bad things happening to good people. Unless you go to the very beginning. Because it didn't start happening until we started to walk outside of the will of God. That's when bad things started to happen to good people. But what did God do? He said, I promise that I will make all things work together for good. Because in every one of those stories, we have a message. We have a message of a faithful Father, a loving Father, a Father that will make things happen anyway. That will use he sees, where we see oppression, He sees opportunity. Where we see destruction, He sees deliverance. It's about His will and not our wants. So how do we stay in His will? And I got to speed this up. How do we stay in His will? It's simply this. It's His Spirit. Did you know in the Old Testament, everything was about how God was with the people. But in the New Testament, it changed. It says that He was in His people. It says that He was in His people. He gave His Spirit. When I was a kid, I got this thing about music. Everything was always about music for me when I was a kid. And when they had the Walkmans, the little kids were like, Walkmans? What is that, right? But y'all remember the Walkmans, right? The very first Walkman was just a radio, right? And then it got fancy. You could play a cassette in it. Kids, you can ask your parents what a cassette is later after church. But you could put a cassette in it, right? And man, look, I was always, every time you saw me, I had headphones on. No matter where I was. At school, I even slit the sleeve of my jacket so that I could run a headphone up into the sleeve of my jacket, and I would sit in class like this, like I was paying attention. But really, I was listening to things I probably shouldn't have been listening to at the time. But it was always about radios, and there was not a doubt in my mind that when I turned that radio on, as long as the battery was in it, as long as it had something to power it, right? As long as the battery was in it, when I turned it on, boy, it was gonna play, right? I want you to know, man, that we were created like a radio. We were created to hear the Spirit, to tune into the Spirit. And I also had this habit of breaking things apart because I wanted to see how they worked. And every now and then you put it back together and you wouldn't put something in the right place, and you know what happened? It wouldn't work anymore. And after the beating that your mom gave you, about a month later, you could talk her into buying you another one. But it's the same way with us. Whenever we step outside of the will of God, whenever we don't stay charged up, whenever we put something in our life that's not supposed to be there, or we take something away that is supposed to be there, it starts to get harder and harder to hear the voice of the Lord. It starts to get harder and harder to hear the Spirit, and we've got to be in tune with the Spirit. But I don't know about you, man, but I got a lot of voices in my head. Don't take that the wrong way. But I got a lot of voices in my head, right? And so how do you know which one is the Spirit? You have to test it. The first thing you do is you test it against the Bible. Because if the voice in your head is asking you to do something that doesn't match up with God's character, that's not the Holy Spirit. Now, of course, the catch is this. If you don't know the Bible, you don't know God's character. If you don't know God, you don't know God's character. But you got to test it against you have to test it against the Bible. Sometimes what the Spirit will do, He'll ask us to do things that we're uncomfortable with. You remember when your parents would ask you to do something? You don't want to do it, right? But you know it's the right thing to do. And so you're just like, fine, I'll just go over here and I'll do it, right? That's kind of how the Spirit works. The Spirit will ask you to do things that's contrary to your character, but never contrary to the Lord's. Test it against the Bible. And the more that you read the Bible, the more familiar God's voice will sound to you. And then test it against your own selfishness. Look, James 4:3 says this, you ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly to spend it on your passions. Look, we're selfish. We're selfish by nature. And so if the voice in your head is asking you to do something that's selfish, I'm going to let you know, man, it's probably not the Spirit. That's you. The Spirit won't ask you to do something that's selfish. We're the ones that have that little rebellious voice, not God. And the last thing is this, does it sound like something that Satan would do? Now this is, you got to be careful. It's like, have you ever been tuning your radio in and like one station is sitting right on top of the other one? And it takes you a second to figure it out. You're just like, wow, I could have sworn that was Chris Tomlin. Why is he singing in Spanish? Right? But it's like, you know what I mean? It sits just right. And it's kind of hard to like, what is going on, man? That's kind of how the devil works. See, he likes to disguise his lies with a little bit of truth. And if you're not careful, if you're not really intentional about listening, you won't notice that the station is sitting right on top of the other one. But when you do, you turn the dial just a little bit and you focus in on the one that's supposed to be there. Whenever you're doing something and you're like, man, something just you might not be able to pinpoint it, but you're just like, that sounds just a little bit off. Right? That sounds a little off. That's a clue that something probably is. Go back and re-examine it. That's the Holy Spirit trying to help you recognize the wrong voice. If the voice is asking you to do anything that doesn't produce a fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, kindness, faithfulness, goodness, patience, peace, it's not the Spirit. Going back to Romans 8:28, look, it's a twofold promise. He says that I will work all things out for the good of those that are called, right? And what else? Those that love God. And here's the deal. We're all called. From the youngest to the oldest, I don't care. There's no retirement plan when it comes to the will of God. There's no retirement plan to the works of the Spirit. If you're still breathing, it's because you're still called to do something. From the youngest to the oldest, we're all called. So the question is this: do we love God? Do we love God? He promised to save us, not spoil us, and that all things would work good. But the catch is what? You got to love God. We're called, but do we love? As we close this up, I'm going to sing one more song as an invitation. And what I want you to do is this: I just want you to re-examine yourself. I want you to examine whether or not maybe you've been sitting here and you're angry with God because He hasn't moved. Maybe you're wondering why you're still in a pit. Maybe you're wondering why you're still in prison. Maybe you're wondering why you've been sold into the slavery of your situation. And you're wondering if God is ever going to move. But you got to come to that point to where He says, even if He doesn't, He's still God. David prayed and prayed and prayed for his son to be healed. The baby that he had with Bathsheba. And when God did not move, David got up and praised God. Because David understood that there's a reason. A move of God can only be stayed by the will of God. So maybe that's you. Maybe you have to come to this place to where you say, it's been too much about me and it needs to be more about you. I need to understand that you've saved me. And if you don't do anything else, that's enough. Maybe you're laying on the floor with a paper towel trying to clean up a slippery mess. I want to leave this open for you to come and have an honest conversation with the Lord. Maybe you know you're called, but you wonder if you've really been loving or not. Whatever it is, I just want you to have this moment, have this time to leave it at the cross. Let's bow our heads.